While the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent hard lockdown had a devastating effect on the economy, however, the Institute for Economic Justice says South Africa has a chance to open a more equitable economy. This would come with bolstering state support for workers, the unemployed and vulnerable businesses. Neil Coleman of the IEJ joins me now with more on this. Neil, good evening and thank you so much for your time. There's a lot that's been said around how South Africa's economy can be worked on, especially taking into account and putting at the center the most marginal amongst us. How can that be done within the current lockdown framework?
Good evening, Kathy. Around the world, there's a debate as to how do governments and societies act in order to ensure that the most vulnerable in society don't take the most amount of pain. And in South Africa, we have a particular toxic combination of factors inherited from our apartheid geography, that people are far away from work, go to work on crowded public transport, live in unsanitary and unsafe conditions, inadequate health facilities, and workplaces themselves not very safe and extremely unequal. So the point is that this is about how do we create a situation in which there's a fair sharing of the pain and the burden of the COVID crisis. So the Institute for Economic Justice has put out a document where we propose a number of measures to ensure that firstly, that the lockdown is, and the opening up of the economy is managed in a more responsible and careful manner, but secondly, that it's done in a more equitable manner so that the burden is shared. So, for example, we see that the frontline workers, the nurses and health workers have been in the news recently as having confronted a really devastating situation in their workplaces. Those frontline workers, like happens in many other countries, should be given a premium on their wages to compensate them for the huge risks that they're taking. The same applies to many other workers in the mining industry and retail, et cetera, et cetera. In order to do that, obviously, we need to reconfigure our wage structure. Some companies already, the CEOs and the management, have either taken wage freezes or wage cuts. That is the sort of thing that should happen across the board, and we should ensure that those at the bottom of the wage structure are fairly remunerated. Similarly with, other what we call social comorbidities, which working people and poor people have to confront daily in their living conditions, going to work and at workplaces.
Neil, would this kind of high-risk pay for high-risk occupations fall under what the unions describe as danger pay? And we've already seen them come out to say that especially those on the front line need to be given some form of danger pay. But there's been incredible pushback from the state on it.
Yeah, of course there is pushback, because the question is, in these sorts of situations, whose voices are loudest? And we saw in the push to reopen the economy rapidly, the voices that were loudest were those of business who wanted to return to profitability, wanted their businesses to run, all of which is understandable. We live in a capitalist economy. That is the rationale that motivates them. But at the same time, there needs to be consideration about the impact that has on ordinary workers. And what the international experience has shown is that through creative use of various mechanisms, in Germany, for example, they've got short time, which is financed by the state, a special scheme. There are other processes where they're aiming to shorten the working week, premium pay for frontline workers. This can be a combination of a reconfiguration of the wage structure as well as state support. What we've seen is that the initial 500 billion rand package has in certain respects not materialized. So many businesses, households and individuals are not getting the support they need. So that package needs to be revised, and perhaps a second wave of the package needs to be introduced, because clearly at the moment, the most vulnerable are taking the biggest burden. And we saw with the CRAM survey, with the loss of 3 million jobs plus another 1.5 million incomes, which overwhelmingly hit poor working class women, that it's very clear who is taking the greatest burden of this pandemic. And measures are needed to mitigate that and to make the organization of work and society more equitable. And that's what we're calling for.
It's such an important point that you're raising about who has really been the hardest hit and based on the research that we have so far. But what it also shows is that the biggest impact is in the informal sector, and that is a sector that is sometimes much less organized than those that are in corporate or that have the representation of unions. How then can government begin to ensure that even the support that it's offering enters that space too? Because even when we talk about the response for SMMEs, that certainly hasn't reached the hawkers, the women who are hawkers and who sell on the street. They haven't had assistance.
No, that's true, Kathy, but it's also true that it hasn't reached people across the board, you know, households in working class community, regardless of the sectors that they work in. Actually, for the informal economy, there have been very coherent and well-argued proposals that have been put forward to government as to how to support informal traders, as to how to ensure that income support through the form of the COVID grant, et cetera, goes to informal workers. And that was what the COVID special grant was partly aimed at. The problem with those grants, as we've seen, is that because they are so there's so many exceptions, so many conditions, so many problems with administrative inefficiencies that it's not reaching the people that it needs to reach. And that's one of the biggest arguments now for the rolling out of the universal basic income grant. And the IEJ has been arguing that we now need a universal grant running up to the phasing out of the COVID grant in October this year. It's clear that with massive rise in the levels of poverty and hunger in our communities, that the need for this income support is now absolutely critical.
All right, Neil, let's leave it there for tonight. Neil Coleman, he is with the IEJ.